participants, and we're going to start in 1 minute, Doctor.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you, Doctor.
Good morning and good evening to ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guest speaker, distinguished teachers and colleagues. Welcome to this highly anticipated guest lecture held by the Physician Clinical Nutrition Specialist Study Program, Department of Nutrition, Faculty of Medicine, University of Indonesia. Today, we are very honored to host a renowned expert in the field, Dr. Walter C. Willett, who will share his wealth of knowledge on a topic of paramount importance in the realm of healthcare, especially clinical nutrition. To start things off, infinite amount of gratitude expressed to the God Almighty, who has blessed us with health so we can gather here together to expand our knowledge even further in the field of clinical nutrition. And also to the honorable speakers, hardworking committee, and the enthusiastic participants. As we know, awareness in the field of clinical nutrition is at its peak, triggered by the COVID pandemic. People are getting more knowledgeable and interested on how to take care of their body better through the things they eat. The increasing prevalence of obesity, non-communicable diseases, and metabolic diseases significantly affect the quality of lives of many people. For that reason, the topic finding a path to healthy and sustainable diets will be our main topic, so we can be more adept and educated in this topic. And today's topic will be taught by the one and only Dr. Walter C. Willett, who is a professor of epidemiology and nutrition, Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. To officially open this guest lecture, we would like to invite our Honorable Head of Physician Clinical Nutrition Specialist Study Program, Dr. Diana Sunardi, Magister Gizi, Spesialis Gizi Klinik Konsultan. The time and screen is yours, Dr. Diana.
Thank you, Dr. Arya. Good morning, participants, and also Prof. Willett, of course. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Willett for giving us lecture today, because we are very happy that not only our residents or students, but also our fellow doctors and also fellow rectors from universities all over Indonesia will have a chance to have a new insight on the sustainable diet. And we are looking forward for a continuing collaboration between us, the Department of Nutrition, Faculty of Medicine, Universitas Indonesia, with your department in Department of Nutrition at Harvard University, of course. And once again, thank you very much. And of course, to all participants, enjoy the lecture and hoping that you can get a lot from this lecture today. Thank you, Dr. Arya.
Thank you, Dr. Diana, for the opening remarks. Before we move on to the main course of the day, we would like to invite everyone to open up their camera and put up their best smile to start the day, and the committee will help to take us the documentation of today's event. We will wait for about 10 seconds for everyone to open up their camera so you can see your bright faces on the screen. There are going to be 5 slides here. Okay, so we can ask for the help for the first slide sessions in 1, 2, 3, smile. And then the second slide in 3, 2, 1, smile. All right, for the third screen in 3, 2, 1. Nice. And the fourth screen in 3, 2, 1. And the fifth in 3, 2, 1. And then the last one in 3, 2, 1. All right. Thank you for your cooperation. And without further ado, we will invite the moderator of today's guest lecture, our brilliant and bright colleague, Dr. Nadhira Nuraini Afifa, Master of Public Health. The time and screen is yours, Dr. Nadhira.
Thank you, Dr. Arya. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Nadhira Afifa, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's session. So in the next 1 hour, we will have a very interesting session on the topic, finding a path to healthy and sustainable diets, with a very special guest as well. He is Dr. Walter Willett. Dr. Willett is the professor of epidemiology and nutrition at the Harvard School of Public Health, which also served as the chair of the Department of Nutrition at Harvard for 25 years. He has published over 2,000 research papers, primarily focusing on lifestyle risk factors for heart disease and cancer. Dr. Willett has also authored the textbook Nutritional Epidemiology, published by Oxford University Press, and 4 books for the general public. His profound impact in nutritional science has made him the most cited nutritionist internationally, and is also a recipient of many national and international awards for his research. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Walter Willett. Good evening to you, Doctor.
Good. Thank you. Let me share my screen here.
Sure.
Okay. I'm very glad to be able to join you today. It's cold and snowy here in Boston, and I think that's a little bit different than where you are right now. I unfortunately haven't yet had a chance to visit Indonesia, but I hope that will be possible before too long. And I'm very happy to be talking to so many people interested in nutrition. It's my great pleasure to do so. As you heard, I'm going to be talking about finding a path to healthy and sustainable diets. Most of what I'll be talking about is based on the Eat Lancet Commission report that I co-chaired with Johan Rockström from Sweden. This was funded by the Wellcome Trust, which was very important because it allowed us to bring together 35 scientists from different disciplines: nutrition, agriculture, earth sciences, social sciences, and other disciplines as well. This is a complicated question, and it really required the expertise of many different people. The challenge we were given was how to feed what will be about 9.8 billion people in 2050 a diet that is both healthy and sustainable. That sounds simple, but in fact, it's extremely challenging. I think, as many of you know, almost all countries around the world are experiencing an obesity epidemic. These are the high-income countries, men and women. Rates are going up quite steadily. The rates are still lower in low and middle-income countries, but they're actually going up faster than in the high-income countries. So it's very likely that these trends will converge not too far in the future. And of course, I think, as you all know, in many parts of the world, we still are dealing with problems of undernutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, and sometimes even energy intake and protein intake. So we have complicated challenges in the nutrition side of the global issues that we're addressing. But we also have huge challenges on the environmental side. In fact, I think even more urgent and pressing challenges. Most apparent is the rapid increase in climate change that is happening around the world. And the problem is that this is not linear. As you can see, there's an acceleration in increases in global temperatures. This goes up to 220, but the hottest year in the world was the year that was just finished, 2023. So there seems to be this unrelenting, accelerating increase in climates and global temperatures. The problem is, of course, that many of these changes that are happening, the melting of the Greenland ice cap, the Antarctic ice cap melting, and many of these changes are not going to be reversible. So what's happening here is particularly troublesome because they're accelerating and many are irreversible. So how to take on this challenge, these very complicated issues? Our commission pondered this for a while, and we broke it down into 4 steps. First of all, defining a healthy reference diet using the best available evidence from controlled feeding studies, long-term cohort studies, and randomized trials. At the same time, our colleagues in the earth sciences have been examining planetary boundaries. In other words, what are the limits for the amount of greenhouse gases that we could emit? What are the limits for cropland use, water use, nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer applications, and limits on extinction rate? And they've defined planetary boundaries that represent the limits of these kind of intrusions on our environment. And then we used a global food system modeling framework to analyze what combinations of readily implementable measures are needed to stay within food production boundaries while still delivering healthy diets by 2050. And then we looked at some strategies. I won't talk about that too much today because that's a very complex issue itself. So how do we define a healthy diet? I think we all agree that everyone should have a healthy diet, but what do we mean by a healthy diet? So we looked at diet starting at 14 or 15 different food groups. And for each group, we looked at the range of kinds of evidence. And for an example here, I will look at major protein sources because those have the choice among the major protein sources has major implications for health and for the environment. So the first step was just to look at the composition, nutrient and other composition of major protein sources. For example, here we're looking at the ratio of polyunsaturated to saturated fat. And I think you know that the polyunsaturated fat reduces LDL cholesterol, saturated fat increases LDL cholesterol. So this ratio has been used for many decades, in fact. And what we know, of course, is that beef has very high amount of saturated fat, but low amounts of polyunsaturated fat that is very beneficial. So this has a very bad ratio. Chicken is better. Salmon is better than chicken. But if we really want to have a good PS ratio, then we need to look at plant protein sources, such as almonds and other nuts, tofu, other soy products, and beans. So this would suggest that these foods would have a better effect on keeping blood cholesterol lower and thereby reduce coronary heart disease. But that's still very indirect evidence. So then we looked at randomized trials that have looked at different protein sources in relation to risk factors like LDL cholesterol for heart disease. And so what's important here is the comparison. And I think, you know, when we're talking about any component of diet, we can never say that's good or that's bad. It's always, what is it being compared with? That comparison makes a huge difference. So if we look at red meat, and this I should mention is a meta-analysis of about 24 studies that have looked at the effect of different protein sources on risk factors, including LDL cholesterol. So if we look at red meat compared to usual diet, there's really no significant difference. But usual diet is mostly unhealthy foods, unfortunately. So just because something doesn't show any effect compared to the usual diet, that doesn't mean that it's good. It means it's as bad as usual diet. If we compare red meat to other animal protein sources like fish, poultry, and dairy foods, then red meat has a fairly neutral effect also. But if we compare red meat to high quality plant proteins like legumes, soy, and nuts, as predicted by their composition, then we see that red meat increases LDL cholesterol. So this would imply that we would be better to replace red meat mostly with these high quality protein sources from plants. This kind of analysis has been extended by some of our colleagues in Germany using what they called a network meta-analysis. This included 66 randomized trials of different food groups looking at their effects on risk factors for cardiometabolic disease. And these included blood lipid fractions, measurements of glucose homeostasis like hemoglobin A1C and insulin resistance, blood pressure, and inflammatory factors, specifically C-reactive protein. And from the effects on these different risk factors, they created a score for better cardiometabolic risk. And so as you can see, nuts had the best score as predicted by, again, the composition of nuts. Legumes also had a very good score. Whole grains a good score. Fish, quite good. Fruits and vegetables. But then we started to run into foods with lower scores, refined grains, red meat, eggs, dairy, and sugar-sweetened beverages. And of course, sugar-sweetened beverages have no nutritional benefits, only harms. So again, this emphasizes that plant protein sources would tend to be the healthier choices compared to animal protein sources, except for fish being relatively good. But that still doesn't look at what we're really interested in, which is disease prevention and maintaining good health. And ideally, we might have randomized trials that say looked at red meat versus soy products and randomized many thousands of people and then followed them for many years to see who developed lower risk of heart disease. But of course, those trials would be almost impossible and extremely expensive if they were to be possible at all. So the next best kind of study will usually be prospective cohort studies. And so our group has been engaged in conducting those kinds of studies, prospective cohort studies, for the last almost 50 years now. The Nurses' Health Study was the first large study we started. Actually, my colleague, Frank Spicer, started the Nurses' Health Study in 1976, initially to look at oral contraceptives and breast cancer. But I realized this would be a really good place to study the long-term effects of diet. So we developed standardized self-administered dietary questionnaires to assess dietary intake over the past year. And we conducted a series of pilot and validation studies and started collecting data on diet in 1980. And these are what we call semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaires. Most of them are about 130 items long. I won't go into all the details, but we have documented their validity in many different ways. So what's important here is we go along in time, we have participants filling out this dietary questionnaire every 4 years, and then on alternate years and on the same years, we collect data on other risk factors like smoking and physical activity, other aspects of lifestyle, medications, and health events like cancer, cardiovascular disease. And then we document those health events by getting medical records. And for tumors, cancers, we often get tumor tissue. And this is really important to have these repeated measures over time because the food supply is changing and people are changing their personal preferences over time. If we didn't have those repeated measurements, we've seen we would miss a lot of what we have learned. Along the way, we've collected biological samples, nail clippings for trace elements, blood samples for analysis of nutrient levels, hormones, many other factors, and urine samples, and we have DNA from the blood samples, of course. So this was 121,000 women. About half of them are still alive. We're still following them. But we also wanted to include men. So we enrolled 52,000 men who were mainly dentists and veterinarians. And again, following the same way, keeping track of diet over time. And then many of the epidemiologic findings were pointing to earlier life risk factors acting in childhood, adolescence, and early adult life. So we enrolled a cohort of younger women who were 25 to 42 years of age in 1989. And we've been collecting, again, diet and other risk factors and tracking disease rates in this younger cohort as well. And I should point out that these are obviously large, complicated studies, and this is really the work of many people, including Frank Spicer, who started the original Nurses' Health Study, and many other people. I won't go through all of the names here, but in fact, this is not a full list, and many other people have contributed over time to these studies. So we have, for this particular work, trying to identify optimal diets, We looked at many disease outcomes. I won't show all of those. Here we're looking at total mortality in the combined cohorts. So we had about 130,000 participants in this analysis, and about 30,000 of them died during the follow-up period, over a period of about 30 years. So we've then been able to look carefully at different sources of protein. And here the comparison is dairy. So everything is compared to dairy here, adjusting for total energy intake, adjusting for smoking, physical activity, and other risk factors. And what we see is the worst type of protein source, not surprisingly, is processed meat. This would include things like sausages and other preserved meats. Eggs also look not so good. Unprocessed meat, just a little bit worse than dairy. Then fish and poultry being pretty similar to dairy foods. But if we really wanted to go to low risk, again, it would be the plant protein sources. So on the basis of these different kinds of evidence, we can be quite confident that there is a causal relationship between the source of protein and mortality, because we have both the long-term cohort studies, and we have randomized trials looking at risk factors like blood pressure and LDL cholesterol. So this would suggest that we keep red meat consumption fairly low, but the question is, how much red meat would be possible in a diet that's optimally healthy? So here we looked at diabetes, type 2 diabetes is the outcome here, and we used this because we had a large number of cases. In this analysis, we had about 200,000 men and women with over 13,000 incident cases of type 2 diabetes over, again, about 30 years of follow-up. And we saw a quite linear relationship between increasing amounts of red meat in the diet and risk of type 2 diabetes. And this has been confirmed in many different studies now, that there is a positive relationship. So this is sort of like blood pressure or blood glucose, where there's a quite continuous relationship. And so where do we draw the line and say, this should be our target level? That's certainly not zero cholesterol or zero blood pressure. So we saw that even at the second category of red meat consumption, there was a small but significant increase in risk of type 2 diabetes. So we didn't want to recommend that level. So we took the midpoint between that and the lowest level. And this is equivalent to about 1 serving per week. So we set that as our target level. And this is 1 serving with about 80 to 100 grams per serving. I know that in different places, serving sizes are different, but this amounts to about 80 to 100 grams of red meat once per week. It's interesting, someone else another group looked at this literature. They came out to about 19 grams per day, which actually on a per day basis, this is about 14 grams per day. So there's, again, seem to be looking at this from multiple different perspectives. Some level it's quite modest, but we don't necessarily have to be a total vegan and avoid all red meat. The risk will be quite low if we keep it at a level of about 14 grams per day. More recently, this is a paper we published just a few months ago. We've used the statistical method to calibrate our dietary questionnaires, which we know are not perfect. They never can be perfect. And we calibrated them against careful weighing and measurement of food intake among about 1,300 participants in a sub-study we did. And so this is the slope that we observed without calibration. If we did correct for measurement error, then we actually increase the apparent slope here relating red meat to risk of type 2 diabetes. And this is total red meat, this is processed red meat, and here is unprocessed red meat. In each case, if we correct for measurement error, that slope becomes steeper here. And we can see that the relative risks actually get quite substantial if we are looking at the higher intakes of red meat. And this is all in servings per day. So we went through this kind of process for each of the major food groups, looking at their composition, looking at randomized trials with risk factors as outcomes, and also looking at long-term cohort studies, and to try to identify what would be close to a reasonable best diet. And so we came up with this table. This is in our Eat Lancet Commission report. And I'll just go through a few numbers here. This is standardized to 2,500 calories per day, which is about average intake in Western countries. It may be somewhat lower in Asia, some Asian countries, although a lot of times it's underestimated. This is actually measured by doubly labeled water. So we have a pretty confident estimate here. We're quite confident in this estimate. So this is, I won't go through all of these numbers in detail, but looking at grains, what's really important that they be primarily whole grains, not refined grains. In other words, brown rice instead of white rice. And there's a lot of flexibility here. As long as they're whole grains, we could see that a wide range of intakes would be possible with whole grains. But many countries are, especially in low-income countries, are actually higher than 60% of energy. And that's provides a large glycemic load and, of course, displaces a lot of other potentially healthy foods. Grains look better than potatoes, so we kept those quite low. Vegetables, this is about 5 servings a day of fruits and vegetables. Dairy is a very interesting topic, and it's very interesting in Indonesia as well. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because when we looked, we could see that about 5 servings a day, or about 500 grams per day, would you can clearly be healthy as a vegan. So 0 is included in the range for all the animal protein sources. This range seemed to be healthy, but we start to have increased risk of prostate cancer if we go higher. And we picked the midpoint of that range because, and I'll come back to this, if we went to 2 servings a day, we couldn't keep the diets within the planetary boundaries for greenhouse gas emissions, because dairy production does emit a large amount of greenhouse gas. So red meat, I already mentioned, we came out to be about 14 grams per day. That's about 1 hamburger per week. If you measure, if hamburgers are your units, chicken and poultry a bit more, because their health impact is somewhat favorable compared to beef and lamb. And eggs, about 2 eggs per week. Fish, about 2 servings a week, or fish or other seafood. But emphasizing plant protein sources, which is what both the short-term risk factor trials and the long-term cohort studies suggest. So that's dry beans, lentils, peas, soy, and nuts. And some combination of those is probably best, not just all one or all the other. And then I should go back. In terms of added fats, emphasizing unsaturated plant oils like soybean oil or rapeseed oil, and some saturated fats are possible. This would include, of course, butter, but also very important in Southeast Asia, palm oil, which doesn't seem to be as healthy as unsaturated fats, but doesn't have to be totally 0 either. And then added sugars, quite low. This is less than 5% of energy from added sugars. Now, when we put all this together, it looks sort of complicated, something too complicated to guide individual diets. It really comes down to something, though, very simple. The whole pattern really describes a flexitarian diet. And interestingly, it comes out to be very similar to traditional diets of many parts of the world. The Mediterranean diet has been studied most intensively, but actually it comes out to be something that's not too different than traditional diets in many parts of the world. Basically, it's if we want to be totally vegetarian or vegan, that would fit within this flexitarian diet. But if we wanted to have some animal sources of protein, it could include about 1 serving of dairy a day, and then 1 serving of other animal source protein per day, such as some fish, poultry, eggs, but just keeping red meat not more than once a week. Now, I've been studying the Indonesian diet a little bit as part of our E-Lancet Commission, and Dr. Rina Augustina from Jakarta is a member of our commission, and so she's shared the recent survey of nutrition in Indonesia, and it's quite apparent that dairy consumption is very, very low in Indonesia, as it is in many parts of the world. So it's not necessary to have 1 serving of dairy a day, and this might be replaced by more seafood, for example. But of course, this is also on a base of nuts, soybeans, fruit, vegetables, whole grains, and plant oils as being really the core of a flexitarian healthy diet, as we could see. Now we're working at present on updating our E-Lancet Commission report, and a lot more of our effort will be on how this translates to other countries, other eating cultures around the world. And Dr. Augustina has created some very good examples and beautiful pictures of the Indonesian diet, which is, again, it's not very far away from this, what we call a planetary health diet. This happens to be an example from Vietnam. And as you can see, plant protein sources are the dominant parts of protein intake in Vietnam. Here are soy, very flavorful meal, lots of vegetables. I have been to Vietnam, and the vegetable consumption here is just astonishing with variety and amounts, and vegetables in multiple ways. The one modification we did make was replacing white rice with brown rice. And I think many people, colleagues, said that's going to be very difficult, but my colleague, Mai Pham, who's a chef from Vietnam, says actually she has most of her customers now consuming brown rice. That after tasting it and it's well prepared, they actually prefer it. And if this is not strictly vegan, though, if someone would like some fish or other modest serving of animal sources of protein, that can certainly be included. Of course, I think, as you're well aware, one other aspect of many Asian diets that does need to be modified a little bit is reduction in sodium intake, which is very high in parts of Asia. This is an example from Costa Rica. And here the sources of plant proteins are beans primarily, very flavorful, well prepared, grains, whole grains from many different sources. Again, lots of vegetables, and if someone would like a bit of seafood there as well. Here's an example from West Africa, and this is a wonderful dish. If you haven't had a chance to try it, it's sweet potato and peanuts stew, and it's very flavorful, spicy, and this could make almost a whole meal by itself. Greens are very much a part of traditional African diets, and this is another dish made with very traditional dish made with whole grains, beans, very flavorful. And again, this combination could be easily a whole meal. And if someone wanted, again, there's a modest amount of some seafood there. So we're hoping to expand this set of examples, but it's apparent that many diets around the world are really quite close to what we describe as a healthy planetary health diet. But unfortunately, in many parts of the world, these diets are being abandoned and lost by commercial industrial diets. So a lot of what we need to do is not change diet too much, but protect the healthy traditions. We did, of course, a nutrient analysis on the planetary health diet. And basically, this looks very good. I would flag here, if one goes much less than 2 servings of animal sources of protein per day, then vitamin B12 can be low and may require supplements or very careful selection of foods to make sure vitamin B12 is adequate. Calcium intake, by some standards, is lowish, looks low by United States standards, but the World Health Organization has said 500 milligrams a day is adequate. And I do know from the survey that Dr. Augustina shared that intake in Indonesia is very low, about 250 milligrams per day on average, I think, for adults in Indonesia. And that's probably lower than it should be, but I actually think the 500 milligram is probably a good target, and the planetary health diet is well above that. But in general, this looks very good from a nutrition standpoint. This is a paper that we published about 3 years ago now, 4 years ago now, looking at milk intake and risk of hip fracture, because the main justification for high dairy consumption has been to provide calcium to reduce fracture risk. But the data actually do not support that. I could talk for an hour just about this very interesting topic, but it was interesting in the literature, the country with the lowest hip fracture rate was actually Indonesia. And also the milk consumption, dairy consumption in Indonesia was almost zero here. It was the lowest of all the parts that we could see. And the highest fracture rates are actually in the high milk consuming countries here. And that makes this really interesting. This seems like a paradox, but I think the main reason is that we don't really need that much calcium. And it's very clear you can have low calcium intakes down at quite low levels here, below 500 milligrams a day, and have low fracture risk. And there's some other reasons why fracture rates are higher in the milk drinking countries. So how far off are different parts of the world from the planetary health diet targets? And the differences around the globe are really extreme here. I don't have time to go through all of these numbers, but for red meat, clearly though, North America is way beyond what would be optimal for a healthy diet. But other parts of the world, this is East Asia Pacific, which would include Indonesia, red meat consumption is very low, and there's some possible room for a small increase if that was to be desired, but there's, again, no health reason to actually increase red meat. And sub-Saharan Africa is right about the target number. I should say the target number is this values here represented by this vertical red line here. But on the other hand, starchy vegetable intake is too high in Africa, and this is really reflecting poverty, and to a large extent cassava intake. And this is resulting in poverty diets with poor nutritional balance. Egg consumption, highly variable around the world. Dairy consumption, again, low compared to even this one serving a day in many parts of the world. Fish consumption, lower than optimal in most places, but almost everywhere there would be benefit from increasing vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, and nuts. And particularly nuts, there's very positive health benefits, but intakes are way below the target number. So how much mortality might we reduce if everyone adopted the planetary health diets? We've done some analyses that were in our Eat Lancet Commission report published in 2019, but we've also we're doing some updated analyses now. These are data from our own cohorts looking at diet intake over almost 40 years now and total mortality. And here over 50,000 participants have died by this time. And here we're looking at increasing deciles of adherence to the planetary health diet. And we see declining mortality, about a 30% lower mortality in the highest group compared to the lowest group. This is in women, this is in men, same pattern. We've also, though, looked carefully at the environmental impacts of the planetary health diet, numbers that we derive for health. And this involved using life cycle analysis, looking at, for example, greenhouse gas emissions per serving for different food groups. And red meat has, especially beef, has the highest greenhouse gas emissions per serving. This is about 160 times more greenhouse gas emissions per serving than for soy or legumes. Pork, chicken, fish, dairy, eggs certainly less than red meat, but still these are 30 to 40 times higher than the plant sources of protein. And pretty much all the plant foods are quite low in greenhouse gas emissions. So again, for environmental reasons, this would certainly favor shifting toward an emphasis on plant protein sources. Then in this analysis that I just showed you, we've also looked at greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts for quintiles of the Planetary Health Diet Index. And we saw, for example, that for the top quintile compared to the lowest quintile, there's about a 29% lower greenhouse gas emissions per person. Fertilizer use, about 21% lower. Land use, or cropland use in particular, about a 51% lower use of land, which is really critical because as we expand land use, we're destroying forest, jungles, and prairie, and that has really adverse effects on the environment. Irrigation water also lower with greater adherence to the planetary health diet. So it's very clear that for greenhouse gas emissions, we would benefit greatly from shifting to the planetary health dietary pattern. But we've also seen to totally limit greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts adequately, we need a dietary shift, most importantly, but also to reduce food waste and food loss, and also to improve agricultural production methods to be more efficient. But I wanted to put this in a larger perspective of limiting climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, by far the biggest impact of greenhouse gas emissions, or the largest source of greenhouse gases, is from burning fossil fuels for energy production, industry, buildings, and transportation. Food looks like it has and does have a somewhat lower contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. But if to reach the Paris limits for keeping greenhouse gas emissions under 2 degrees centigrade, we need to both almost eliminate fossil fuel consumption. But if we don't also change our diets, we can't stay within the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So it's not one or the other. We need to virtually eliminate fossil fuel consumption and also shift our diet to the Eat-Lancet targets. And of course, this is a big challenge here, negative emissions, which means capture of carbon by the food system through better agricultural practices, and most importantly, reforesting land wherever we can. So that's a quick overview of a diet that could be both healthy and sustainable, feeding 10 billion people, which we'll have by about 2050, a diet that is healthy and keeps us within safe planetary boundaries is possible, and it would improve the health and well-being of billions of people. This could allow us to pass on to our children a viable planet. But it's very clear that these challenges are huge, and it will require the efforts of almost everyone if we're going to stay within those limits. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Willett, for that very enlightening presentation. So I think, like, to fulfill a healthy and sustainable diet, like you explained before, then we need, like, most importantly, a collective effort, right, to achieve all of that. And before moving on to our Q&A session, I think I would like to ask a question first. So, doctor, if we plan to have this plant-based diet that, like you mentioned before, then there's this concern about the risk of having deficiency, right? Like B12 or so, like heme. Like, what do you think about this? Like, do you think we need like certain routine supplementation then if we choose to have the plant-based diet, or do you have any other suggestions? Thank you.
Right. Yes, definitely we have to have nutrient adequacy. And I think it's very, if we have this, what we call flexitarian diet, that is about 2 servings of animal sources of protein per day, from all our examination of this will provide adequate micronutrient intake. And interestingly, it is the traditional diet. It comes out to be very close to the traditional diet of Greece, which has been studied extremely well, and has provided a population when people were really eating that diet in the 1960s that was the healthiest diet, the healthiest population in the world. There are some issues, especially iron intake for premenopausal women. And I think each country needs to look at their nutrient status carefully. Because the different grains provide different amounts of iron. Some of these are absorbed less well and better. If there are places where there is micronutrient inadequacy, I think there are several choices, and you mentioned supplementation as being one of them. It could be shifting. Some people said, well, that's reason to eat more red meat, but that's the least desirable solution to it, because that, number one, you get a lot of less healthy components there, a lot more saturated fat, more cholesterol. And we do see that red meat is related to gestational diabetes, which is becoming much more common in most parts of the world. And also, of course, red meat costs much more. And if you're having red meat on a regular basis is just not affordable to many people. So it's, I think, not the healthiest. It's also not the most affordable, certainly not the most environmentally sustainable. So supplementation is one approach. Fortification of food is also another established public health approach to micronutrient inadequacies. And again, the choice between supplementation and fortification depends on the context, because in a subsistence agricultural system where people are producing most of their own food, fortification doesn't work very well, and supplements would be the preferred solution. So I think this requires a thoughtful evaluation of data in any country, any region's own situation. There's no single solution that is the best, but eating more red meat is the worst, is going to be the worst choice in almost every example.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Very clear answer, I think. So right now we are moving on to the Q&A session with the audience. So we already have, I think, a lot of questions. So allow us to share the screen for the questions, Doctor.
Sure, I'll stop my share now.
Yeah, okay then. So there are some questions coming up. It's from Konsistania Ribuan from Department of Nutrition, Faculty of Medicine, Universitas Indonesia. Thank you, Professor, for your interesting presentation. I'd like to ask about the egg. As we know, eggs are the source of high-quality protein with a high PDAS. However, why do eggs contribute almost 20% of all causes of mortality?
Yeah, just to be clear, that wasn't, they weren't causing 20% of all causes of mortality. That was there was some increase in risk compared to plant protein sources and dairy foods that we're seeing. And that's a good question, and I'm not yet sure about this. And I think it's true that egg consumption is a good source of protein, and it's often one of the least expensive sources of protein from animal sources. And so especially for children, that can be important, where growth is obviously a critical issue, and there's a good amount of many micronutrients in eggs as well. So I think especially for children, that's a practical part of the approach for nutrition. But in adults, I think keeping eggs it can be part of the diet, but not the major source of animal protein would be a good solution. So having eggs, many organizations, our Heart Association has for decades suggested not more than about 2 eggs per week. I actually think that's probably for adults who are at risk of cardiovascular disease, that's probably a good number. But I'm not quite sure, and it's something we're still investigating about why there does seem to be an adverse relationship with egg consumption. The issue about high quality protein actually has been overplayed, that if you have a combination of different plant sources of protein, that can be high quality. And all sources of protein have all the amino acids. There's a misconception that plant protein sources don't include some amino acids. It's just the ratio percentage may be a little bit different. So in general, I don't think we need to worry about quality of protein as long as there's a mix of foods that provide the protein. But yes, I think here we want to consider young children, especially in adults, differently.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. So I think because eggs is also like the alternative source of protein for the children here to prevent stunting, like the big issue in Indonesia right now. So I hope that answers this question. And then we are moving on to the second question. All right, we're having a technical issue, so wait a moment. And then the second one, this is, thank you for the incredibly engaging presentation. So Indonesia possesses a wealth of diverse food, including both animal and plant-based options. However, our national research data reveals a significant deficiency in protein intake coupled with a relatively high consumption of fats. This is believed to be associated with purchasing power and economic conditions. Do you have any recommendations or strategies, particularly for enhancing protein intake? So I think it's more like public health question, Doctor.
Well, it's a very good question. Just with a fat issue, I don't think Indonesia has high fat consumption from anything that I've seen. That I think, that, for example, the traditional Mediterranean diet had about 40% of calories from fat, and it's very healthy. But the type of fat is really important, and this is an issue, I'm sure, in Indonesia, where palm oil is a major source of fat, and which isn't the healthiest source of fat. So, and that's. I think there's some challenges there because palm oil production has some advantages actually ecologically if it's not displacing tropical forests, that it is a very efficient way of producing energy. And actually, I think there are ways with genetic engineering to produce palm oil that's more unsaturated and healthier. So I would hope you can convince your agricultural colleagues maybe to work on that to make palm oil healthier. It's the technology is certainly there to do that, but it takes work and experimentation and development to do that. That's appreciated. So, and a lot of countries in Asia are experiencing an epidemic of diabetes. And actually, I think a high carbohydrate in many parts of Asia is actually a much bigger problem than the fat. Because you get this big glycemic load. But the type of fat, again, is very important, and the type of carbohydrates is very important. But for increasing the protein, again, there's no single solution to approach to all countries there. But from everything we can see, that it would be good to emphasize more healthy plant protein sources. And it's interesting as we look around the world that some places are consuming mostly soy and other places are consuming beans. And actually, it's probably better to have some of both there. That just in general in nutrition, having variety is really important because you don't get too much of something bad and you're less likely to miss out on something good. And also, if bean consumption is too high, it's not tolerated so well in the GI system, where soy is well tolerated. So I think I don't know the specific data in Indonesia, but it would be good to have some balance in the bean production and consumption. And what's really nice about this effort we're doing is we learn so much looking at different diets and different dietary patterns around the world. And it's an opportunity to expand the variety of what people eat. In general, people do like to have variety. And so having, instead of adopting unhealthy components of other culture. So we want to be selective and borrow the healthy aspects of different cultures. So, for example, India has mostly beans and almost no soy. Japan, China have, especially Japan, a lot of soy, almost no beans, to have some balance there. But as I mentioned, nuts are, every time we look in almost every outcome, nuts seem to be the healthiest food of all. And it would be, I think, worthwhile looking into ways to increase nut production and consumption. And peanuts do count. Peanuts are a nut, and they can be relatively inexpensive. So it would be, I think, useful to talk to some of your agricultural colleagues again and consider what are the options for increasing peanut consumption, but of course also cashews and other tropical nuts may well be reasonable to produce in Indonesia. And in general, the nut production and bean consumption has smaller environmental impacts because the legumes actually fix nitrogen in the soil, so you don't need to apply fertilizer in the same way, and while providing a very good protein source at the same time. So again, no simple answer to that, but involves some careful evaluation about what are possibilities, where are the gaps, and then what are the possibilities given the ecological conditions, and that would mean usually working with colleagues in the agricultural world. There are also, I think everyone is aware too, that there are some, I actually saw a video that I think Rena sent me on using insects as a protein source, where the insects were fed food waste and then produce a high quality protein food, high quality protein source. So I think that some of these more novel ways of creating protein sources would be desirable. Of course, I understand that fish consumption, seafood consumption is quite substantial in Indonesia, but we have challenges, of course, in overfishing and actually damaging our marine sources of food. So, but in that area, aquaculture is a good option in some places. China is by far the world's leader in aquaculture now, and this can be done in very small scale levels as well as more larger commercial scale levels as well. So looking into that in a serious way probably makes sense as well. Again, it can work very well in some situations, but not as well in others.
Thank you, Doctor. So I guess that needs a lot of like multi-sectoral collaborations, including like the food technology colleagues, right? So moving on to the third question. So it's interesting that you already mentioned about soy in your explanation, because there's this question about soy as well. So the question is from Judy from Department of Nutrition, Faculty of Medicine, Universitas Indonesia. A very eye-opening lecture, Dr. Willett. I need further information on plant source milk, almond and soy milks that are now highly available in the market and mostly labeled as healthier options. Do you have data on their effect on health outcomes?
Yes, very, very good question. I think this is really important because for environmental issues, especially the plant milks have a much lower environmental impact in general, especially greenhouse gas emissions than cow milk. And they're all a little bit different, so there's no generalization. Probably the best from a nutritional standpoint are the soy milks because they contain a good amount of essential fatty acids. Pretty much all of them have the same amount of calcium and vitamin D because it's fortified. They're not naturally there. And cow milk doesn't have much vitamin D either. It's fortified in the United States and many countries as well. Interestingly, so I think soy milk has the best nutrient profile. And almond milk actually doesn't have much fat or fiber in it. It's mostly carbohydrate and a little bit of healthy fatty acids, but most of the healthy fats in the fiber are not there in the milk. The ones that are there in the almond itself are not present in the milk. They've been removed. So that, I think, is something that doesn't have a lot of nutritional value, but it's what products I've seen are relatively low calories. So if one wants to drink a white liquid that looks like milk and not get too many calories and nothing too bad, that's a pretty good choice as well. One of the questions raised about it is that in places where almonds are grown, they use quite a bit of water, but it's still not as bad as the water use from milk production, because you have to feed the cows a lot of food that's been produced with a lot of water. So actually, we shouldn't condemn almond milk as being worse than cow milk, but compared to some of the other products, it does use a fair amount of water. There's rice milks available. Actually, those are basically unhealthy carbohydrates, and I would stay away from those. They're not much else than starch, actually, and that's not so good. And in most of these, you have to watch the amount of added sugar. That some of them have quite a bit of added sugar, so the no added sugar products will in general be better. But I think this is an important area for replacing milk, or as an alternative to milk, but still probably having the almond as an almond rather than making it into milk is going to be a whole lot better.
Thank you, Doctor. So actually, like, consuming almond milk is not so harmful, but not so beneficial as well. So it's better to consume like almond as the whole almond. Okay, Doctor, do I still have like time for one more question? Thank you, Doctor. So this is actually not the last question, but it's very late in Dr. Willett's time right now. So thank you so much for the insight, Professor. It's from Sari from PK4 Kediri Hospital. So she chose to be a pescatarian for the part of her daily diet for the vitamin D intake. Do you think it's enough from the daily diet itself, or should pescatarians need more dose of vitamin D supplements?
I think unless you eat a huge amount of fish, it really won't provide nearly enough vitamin D. You almost have to be a seal to get enough vitamin D from eating fish. It is a very important question that we do see that many people are low in vitamin D. And that's related to our lifestyle, where we work inside buildings and we put on clothes and cover up. And it's interesting, in China, a study we did showed they had the lowest vitamin D levels were in Shanghai. And I wondered why that was the case. And then I visited Shanghai, and I noticed when the sun came up, people put on umbrellas. Here, we put umbrellas up when it rains. So they're really consciously avoiding sunlight there for cultural reasons. And so it's very interesting that our culture can sometimes get in the way of our health. In this case, low vitamin D levels now we see related to dementia, higher risk for some infectious diseases, and more severe, it looks like COVID. So having enough vitamin D is really important, and fish is not going to provide enough. I think myself, what I take is a multiple vitamin with a good amount of vitamin D in it. That's actually quite inexpensive, and it just makes sure you're going to get enough. Here in the wintertime, in cold climates, we get almost no vitamin D. So the levels get quite low in the winter here in Boston if we don't take some supplements.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Willett. So I think that's all the questions that we have. So as our session comes to a close, I'd like to remind some take-home messages from our session today. So first, we need to think of not only a healthy diet, but also a sustainable one for our planet. And based on the several long cohort studies, it shows that high-quality plant protein actually have a more beneficial impact in form of lowering LDL cholesterol and reducing risk of type 2 diabetes compared to animal protein sources, especially red meat. And recommended serving per week for red meat in relation to lowering risk of having type 2 diabetes is around 84 grams per week. And for the healthier and more sustainable diet, it is recommended to shift into plant-based food sources. Okay, then thank you so much, Dr. Willett. We once again would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to you for your invaluable insights, and we hope you enjoy the session as much as we do, and have a good rest. And also thank you so much to all of you for your engaging questions. Hope we all can take the knowledge we've gained today and apply it to make a positive impact. So I'm Nadhira Afifa signing out, now giving it back to Dr. Arya.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Willett and Nadhira, for the insightful lecture and discussion regarding healthy and sustainable diets. As we know, the challenges we face in the field of clinical nutrition are very complex and ever-evolving, and we believe that the discussion and the collective efforts of those who are here will help us shape the future of healthcare and clinical nutrition. And an immense amount of gratitude expressed from us to Dr. Willett, who has spared your precious time and shared with us the current update regarding healthy and sustainable diets. We believe this will inspire us to innovate our medical practices in clinical nutrition even further, so we can influence and educate our patients with the most optimal regimen of diet according to their individualized goals and targets. We also want to express our heartfelt gratitude to the Department of Nutrition, Faculty of Medicine, University of Indonesia, especially the Clinical Nutrition Specialist Study Program, and for our beloved teachers here to be the organizing committee, so we have the opportunity to increase our knowledge in clinical nutrition. And last but not least, heartfelt gratitude to all of us who are here today, the enthusiastic group of long life learners that made this sharing more bright and alive. And we hope to see you again soon in our next session of interesting lectures. My name is Arya, signing out. Have a nice day and evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Willett.
Okay, my pleasure. Hopefully we'll see you someplace sometime.
Hopefully, thank you.
Bye. Bye.